regulations. They have an old zoning code that's 1,500 pages long now, so whenever you do something in that city, you got to look at multiple documents to figure out what's going on. We're trying to unify everything, like Rob said, so that you look in one place to figure out what the rules of the game are. That'll make it not only easier for applicants, I mean, that's an obvious one, but for neighborhood people who want to know what's going on with a project, for you all, planning commissioners, people in the Landmark Commission who administer the ordinance, it's just a benefit to everyone to have things more streamlined and accessible in one place.
We do have a question.
Okay.
You know, it might be good for now or later, maybe after the presentation, but the communication piece is so interesting to me because it seems like we've had, probably those of you that have been here longer than me, but I've seen my share of folks who, they buy a property or they buy a building and then they check on all the requirements and the codes. And we've had conversations internally about how do we help our community understand better, like not only what all the process is, but please look at that first before you make an investment. And I'm just curious, that can be a conversation for later, but it seems to be a big topic in this town.
That's why when the RFP, we had the layperson's guides are included, so those will be paper documents, PDF documents online, and the video. And one of the reasons that I was happy that Keys was on the team is that they've got an Encode product, which allows people to do that. So we want to work that into the layperson's guides, go here, and this is how you use this to find out what you can do and what you can't do, and the video, and bring all those pieces together so that we have an effective tool for people to use so they don't get in that position.
And we'll also have, for the permitted uses, and instead of a laundry list for each district, we'll have a table. And every single use will be defined, and within code, if you use the code online, it'll be hyperlinks. You just click, you'll see the definition. And so that should make it easier for investors, I think, both in terms of identifying places where they want to build something, but also making it clear what exactly is allowed. Okay, thank you. So just our initial analysis, and even I think from the RFP forward, just Rob and his staff's discussion and their work in front of you, in front of the Planning Commission over the years, we put together what we saw as sort of a top 10 list of what we see as what we think the priorities are. And if we missed anything, let us know. But one is, again, to make sure there's a comprehensive framework, that we haven't left anything out. Like, for example, with that list of uses, that we haven't left out key uses that you're getting a lot of applications for, and Rob's staff is having to scratch their head and figure out what district are these allowed in, and so forth, and making sure that your use and setback and building design and standards like that work in concert with your street design standards and so forth. They need to be cohesive so that we're giving applicants and we're giving neighborhoods sort of a unified vision of what's expected of them. Secondly is to make it as user-friendly as possible. Again, you know, most people don't sit down and read a zoning code cover to cover like you would a Harlan Coben novel or something. You look at it when you need to find information about something you're interested in. But the language you're reading needs to be easily understood. And we're working with state law, we're working with federal law, like when we're talking about cell towers and things like that, for example. There's federal law we need to deal with, but to the extent possible, through graphics, through the use of plain English, short declarative active voice sentences, there's a lot we can do to make this a much easier read for people. Number three, we want to make sure we have good community support for what we're doing. This is going to be a community-driven process, not a consultant-driven process. You know, I'm sort of agnostic about what goes in the ordinance myself. What I'm passionate about is finding out what this community wants to see and making sure that it's expressed in the ordinance as clearly as possible. I mean, that's our priority. But once people, we want people to know what we're doing, and we want people in the community to support it. We also want to, number four, make the right things easy. I think, you know, that the traditional, one of the historic knocks on zoning codes is that there's a lot of mandates. But I think to the extent possible, we need to look at incentives. For example, your citywide master plan talks a lot about things like conservation and cluster subdivisions that preserve open space. Some communities mandate it, but maybe there's a way to incentivize it with regulations that are, if you provide the amount and the type of open space this community wants, maybe it should be easier to get through the process. Maybe you get more development potential. Maybe there's other concessions we can make that make it easier to preserve that open space, because that's what the plan talks about. But at the same time, making, developing that kind of subdivision easier for the applicant to do. Number 5, we need to make sure the code's up to date.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Just explain the benefit of doing the incentive versus the mandate.
Well, several things. Number 1, incentives are much more acceptable, to the regulated community. Most people would rather have a door to go through where it's easier to do as opposed to just being told they have to do it. Now, I'm not saying we're getting rid of mandates. There will be a lot of things in the code that are, the permitted uses are the permitted uses, the setbacks are the setbacks. But if there's a way we can make it easier for people to implement the objectives in the comprehensive plan, to implement the design themes that come out from the community and from the Board of Commissioners and the Planning Commission, that's something the regulated community is interested in. It makes it more likely that people are going to invest in Kansas City, Kansas, and Wyandotte County here as opposed to somewhere else, maybe where they could go. So to the extent that we can make things incentive-based, that's always a good thing. You're welcome. Any other questions on that before we go? Number 5 is making sure the code's up to date. And one of the obvious examples is your list of permitted uses. Make sure it contemplates things like short-term rentals, things like new housing types that we see a demand for in the community, and that language is clear and easy for people to understand. Number 6 is sort of tied in with the issue of incentives, but it's also making sure we right-size things. And this comes up a lot with design standards. We can make building design, for example, we can be real fussy about the standards we mandate for buildings, but how many of those do we really need to make the appearance of a building and the function of a building acceptable to the community? Maybe that's a lot of standards. Maybe you all have a lot of things on your agenda that you want to see people accomplish, but maybe there's 4 or 5 things we could put in if people do that, if they put their buildings closer to the street, if they have windows and things at the ground level so that it's when people walk to places, it's interesting to walk to and you're not facing the rear loading portion of the building. Maybe 4 or 5 standards like that, and maybe not be as fussy about how the actual components of the architecture work, for example. We just want to make sure that the standards mandate what needs to be mandated, but don't mandate more. And so that, I think, is critical is in getting this code right and getting that mix of standards that make this an attractive place for people to invest, while at the same time making sure that what comes out of the ground is consistent with your expectations for development. We want to make sure that we're abiding by the one Wyandotte County sort of objective that you've had, that every part of this community is as important as the other, that urban neighborhoods and suburban neighborhoods both have design standards that implement the things that are important to them, and that we're not just cutting back on things because we think some place in this community isn't as important as another. So that's critical. We want to make sure that the processes are clear. We flowchart everything. We write our processes so that each section tells you how you file an application, how we certify completeness, whether you need a public hearing or not, and what your approvals mean. So we've sort of followed that same theme throughout. And we also want to look at maybe ways to streamline things. I looked at your agenda tonight. It's over 400 pages long, and Rob tells me that it was a short one. I don't know how y'all do it. If there are ways we can write standards that are clear and predictable and easy to administer behind the permit counter, maybe you guys can spend more time sleeping as opposed to hearing zoning cases. So that's a good thing if we can get there. We want to avoid nonconformities whenever possible. Sometimes, you know, if we change zoning district regulations and you're very intentional about what you want to do, nonconformities will be inevitable. But to the extent that we can, avoiding nonconformities is a good thing. And we want to make sure that everything we write is legally enforceable. Because that's the difference between a zoning code and a plan. The zoning code is the legal part of your planning process. The plans are your overall policies. So this has to be enforceable on the ground when we're done. So that's my top 10 list when I talk to staff, when I look at your plans. Those are things that you want to make sure you get right when we go forward.
I would just add on the nonconformities, that's the things that people might consider to be grandfathered. And so when we make changes in the code that are different and we have to set a line of, well, that was okay before this year, but it's not okay. Those kind of things make all of our jobs difficult.
Yes. Commissioner Filbert?
Okay, so to extrapolate on that, where you're saying is no grandfathering, when you change the code, then everybody complies?
No.
There will be grandfathering.
Well, I just wanted to make sure I understood what he said.
No, we don't. We want to minimize that to them as much as possible. But when you have an existing condition, you don't have to update that with a new code. You were legal when you built it that way, and so it can remain. But that creates insurance issues, and it creates all kinds of other issues with neighbors and future development. Financing. You've seen a lot of zoning cases lately because somebody had M2 zoning, which like allowed a residential use in that, but they couldn't finance the rehab on that because the financial institution didn't understand that that was an allowed use within the M2. They thought that's industrial, you need residential zoning. And so they forced them to go back and rezone. So there's a lot of things like that we're gonna try and avoid with the way we do the new code.
Right. In a lot of communities I work in find that nonconformities never go away, they just get worse and worse. And then they become a blighting influence on the neighborhood. So, you know, one example is if we have a neighborhood center, for example, and we want buildings to be up to the streets, we have a maximum setback. What do we do with all those buildings that are further back? I mean, are they allowed to do anything? Can they expand, and how? I mean, those are things we need to come to grips with, because otherwise, if we just say you can't do anything unless you tear that building down and bring it up to the front setback, first of all, that's not gonna be real popular with the business community. And secondly, you know, if we successfully pass that, you know, those buildings just tend to deteriorate over time. So, you know, we want new expansions to come forward, you know, to the street, but yeah, we don't want that building to sit empty either.
So what you're saying then is that you're creating a pathway for them to do things
Correct.
that would still work even though they were grandfathered in under something else.
And today, we don't really have that clear path for them. It's a very difficult, if not impossible, process under the current code.
Okay, thank you.
Just to look at your existing districts, and you're all familiar with how your zoning districts work and the structure and everything, but today there are 36 total. There are 21 that came from the old Kansas City, Kansas zoning ordinance. 15 are in the Piper Annex in the western part of the county, the western part of the community. 10 of them are unmapped, although 5 of them have used the parallel plan development process to get applied. And that plan development process where, you know, for the most part, except for your traditional neighborhood development district, which covers around 3 acres of this community, which isn't even a speck on the percentage, that's where most of your design standards and things like that, the things that implement the vision in your citywide master plan really come in. I mean, you can negotiate better building design and so forth, but that only covers 8% of the community. There's got to be an easier way to do that. And so we're looking at, and so, yeah, there's sort of a pie chart that breaks it out. Most of the community, single family, residential or residential duplex, a little bit of duplex and multifamily. You've got a lot, almost 30% is zoned agricultural. But you don't have a lot of real agriculture in your community. You do have issues with animals and so forth. which we'll need to deal with in the regulations, but not a lot of real agriculture, but a lot of agricultural zoning. And 13% industrial, and a lot of communities I work with want to protect that industrial land, because that's your employment base. A lot of people work there, and it's a good thing to have it. So that's kind of a picture of your existing zoning. And then again, this gets to, sort of that dance we're talking about between incentives and mandates. Again, if we mandate everything, you can be sure that if something's built, it's going to comply. For the most part, unless they get a variance. But, that's supposed to be rare that you get variances. And that's another issue that tends to come up. But, to the extent that we mandate everything, and we have a long list of mandates, it's going to be a controversial thing for the community. On the other hand, we could do everything optionally. We could have some really a light set of standards and then just have optional guidelines. And those are nice. I mean, nobody usually objects to guidelines. Even the development community doesn't object to guidelines because they're not binding, and, we can give them an easy path to do them, but, we're not going to see a lot of that happen. People usually default a lot of times to the cheapest and easiest way to build. We want to find something in between. What's the right mix of things this community wants to mandate in the zoning code in terms of building design, in terms of amenities for new projects and so forth, versus the things we want to just make as easy as possible, or to reward with the additional density, or maybe relief from landscaping or parking or so forth. And parking's another big issue we'll talk about in a second. But where is that balance? That's what we're looking for. And again, in the area of comprehensiveness, the zoning code has to cover all the territory, right? We're not just amending one district. We're not just resolving an issue with signs or nonconformities or something. This deals with everything. So, if I had to sit and give you an ordinance by next week, the way it would be organized, and sort of the best practice for organizing them, is having a general chapter that tells the reader what it is you're reading and where to find information. Have something about your design, use patterns, whatever we want to call them, and your zoning up front, because that's the thing everybody's interested in. Your business community, somebody developing property, the first thing they need to look at is the zoning. What uses are allowed? What are my setbacks? How high can I build my buildings? What's my density or floor area? That sort of thing. And that's the first thing the neighborhoods look at as well. I mean, they want to know what's allowed. They're interested in what's going on down the street. They're interested in, how it's going to affect them. Are the buildings going to be too high? Is there going to be too much traffic, et cetera? The next chapter would be your procedures, how you get projects entitled. And then we go to development standards, things like landscaping and parking. And then we get the supplemental use regulations. And so that chapter's going to do a lot of heavy lifting, I think. And I think ideally that chapter is going to include a lot of standards that right now are negotiated on a case-by-case basis, that end up in front of the Planning Commission and end up in front of you at a public hearing. Some that tend to be controversial, some they just have to wait another 15 days or a month to get in front of the Board of Commissioners so they can get something approved. Well, if we can deal with those with standards, it makes everybody's life easier. Then we have to deal with nonconformities. Again, we want to minimize nonconformities, but they have to be dealt with somehow. So there are nonconforming uses or nonconforming structures, or people that may be nonconforming as to our new landscaping and building design standards and so forth. And so how do we deal with those? How are they allowed to go forward? And then when we write a code, we always put the boring stuff in the back, right? So the material, the legal material about, how we set up agencies, what their jurisdiction is, and so forth. The severability clause, which, your legal counsel's familiar with, but nobody ever reads it unless you're in front of a judge. And then at the end, we usually put the glossary. And we may even have a checklist of submittal requirements, right, that's at the end of the ordinance. So that's basically how a development code is laid out. And then I mentioned too, we use a lot of flow charts. We flow chart the processes. We try to create a smooth workflow and a transparent workflow so that applicants know how they file applications, how completeness review works, what kind of process they have to undergo, And then what, once they're approved, what that approval means. Does that take them to the next step of the process? Does that mean they can go in and file for a building permit? What does that mean? And so all of that will be included in the process standards. And then, again, looking at better standards that deliver the quality of development you're looking for in a way that's context-specific. So a new building downtown or a new building in Strawberry Hill or an urban neighborhood near downtown is going to have different building design, different setbacks, and so forth than a building in western Wyandotte County, where the densities are lower. People may have built, or then people may live out there because they expect a different type of development pattern. They don't mind driving someplace, but when they get there, they want the buildings to look nice, right? So that's going to mean, while every part of the community is important, the standards are going to vary somewhat because they have to reflect the character areas in the community. They have to reflect the citywide master plan and so forth. And then again, in terms of making the ordinance more user-friendly, we're going to have a lot more tables, so your list of permitted uses will be organized in tables. So if I want to build if I want to do a bed and breakfast, all I got to do is scroll across and it'll tell me what districts are allowed in. It'll tell me immediately if I'm in the right district, or if I'm investing, maybe I need to go somewhere else that's already zoned that way, or go through the zoning process.
And that will also link to Encode. So that table, when you go into Encode and say, I want to do a bed and breakfast, it will show you on the zoning map what zoning districts are available for that, and even what commercial properties are for sale and for lease, and what land bank properties are in those districts.
Right. We'll have italicized purpose statements, so it won't be a mystery why the development standards are there. They come from, some policy in your comprehensive plan or some policy in an area plan. And then we'll have graphics and images that show, what this looks like. They'll be three-dimensional. We can even use pictures for some things. And we have a huge image library to draw from. And so with that, I've just got a few teaser questions here for you all, and then with whatever time we have left before your main meeting tonight, anything else that you can think of that you'd like me to hear before we start this process. So I'll start by just asking, based on your experience as commissioners with the zoning ordinance, and based on what you hear from your constituents and so forth, what are some of the top changes you'd like to see occur? If there are three things that could come out of this process, what would those three things be? Anybody think of anything?
Well, it would just go to that question, the top bullet point on the right. What type of development is being precluded or stymied by the current regulations?
Sure.
And so that's an interesting question, and I'm sure you'll be, when you talk with developers and, small rehabbers, I'm really concerned, that especially for the small-scale developers, that, and maybe it's not the regulations all the time, maybe it's the process, certainly the cost sometimes, because, for a small developer, someone who's just come in and rehabbing, let's say a single commercial building, that they look at the cost up front, they may not be in a position to really they would look at the process and see all the fees and costs associated with just going through the process, and that might actually discourage investment. So that might be a different question than whether the process itself or the regulations stymie development, but I think it's also something for us to consider. And that fourth bullet point on the left, how can the zoning regulations respond better to the needs of applicants? Again, how do they enter into the process in a way that encourages them and says, oh, I can see my way through this, and there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay. And I think building on what you said too, a couple of the gorillas in the room with zoning that can be hot button issues and can also actually discourage kind of through regulations the vision the community has said it wants to achieve. One is parking, and a lot of places are overparked, and sometimes they're overparked because the developer chose to put in twice the amount of parking that your regulations required, but for your small developer, let's say you've got a small lot, and you're downtown, and you'd like to do a nice restaurant or something, but the zoning code requires so many spaces, you'd have to buy 3 lots to put in a restaurant that would be a nice asset for the community. It would bring in business and tax revenues and places for people to walk. A lot of communities are going to, at least partially, eliminating minimum parking, letting the market dictate that. I mean, what kind of developer is going, I mean, developers have a hidden an interest in putting parking in anyway, but, you know, parking is just simple geometry. It takes up, math isn't my best subject, but it takes up a lot of space, and that can be used better.
And I think that's an important point, because I think when you look at, let's say, even the Strawberry Hill area, if someone wants to open a restaurant and the parking requirements are such, it might discourage that. At the same time, understand that the people who live in the neighborhood want to be able to park in front of their homes, and that's a serious consideration. So it's one of those things where we have, that's a difficulty. I'm not sure how that's going to be resolved, but I know Commissioner Johnson had a question.
At least one. As we look at the understanding part, and this is on slide number 6, one of the things that kind of came into my mind was that we need to be, as we're writing or rewriting this, that we need to be culturally competent in terms of the language. We have cultural, different language issues, and so as we talk about being user-friendly, it needs to be user-friendly across cultures, so that persons that are from other ethnicities or different backgrounds can understand the process. And then our engagement, I think, relative to community support, I think should be very deliberate in terms of, and this is not just for persons that may be from different areas of the country or different lands, but I'm just thinking about it as a layperson. If I didn't have the experience that I have now as a commissioner, I would be very ignorant to the process and might make some major financial blunders before, you know, I realize what all of the steps are in the process. So as we talk about deliberate engagement, maybe we can provide and I'm trying to be real elementary with this, maybe a zoning prep process to let them know before you get started, guys or ladies or whatever. These are some things that you need to consider, and maybe even a cheat sheet, because I'm still learning right-of-way, setbacks, variances. I'm still learning what all those mean as a commissioner. So maybe I shouldn't admit my ignorance to certain things, but I think it would help a lot of our constituents that are, particularly the smaller ones, that are trying to move forward.
We are doing some bilingual information, and the postcards will have a Spanish notice on them as well when they go out. So we're starting that process. There's a long way to go in the bilingual part of our code.
Commissioner Bynum.
Thank you. In my time here, things that I've bumped up against that are not allowed currently per our zoning codes, or have encountered difficulty coming to fruition per our zoning codes, are the tiny houses. We've had issues around locating farmers markets. I think those were parking issues, Rob. I can't remember. The mobile market, the mobile grocer, ended up with a struggle at the end that we didn't get resolved yet.
That's correct.
The little free libraries are not currently allowed by our current code. And those are things that folks in our community have been trying to do to improve quality of life for people here. And then when they bump up against the fact that our code doesn't allow that, I think that needs to be looked at. And then I just want to go back to the communication piece overall. I think the calendar that we follow, the process that we follow, and I think it certainly has certain statutory requirements and deadlines, but it seems clunky. And what people tell us is it seems to take a long time to get through the process?
You know, in the current process, there's probably 10 days maybe that aren't statutorily required. And part of those days are due to the fact that we use the Echo as our publication system, and it only goes out once a week, and so we lose some days there. And we also use some of those days to make it so that we can operate with a smaller staff, so we don't have multiple items piling up at one time, so that they couldn't possibly get done. So, but that is one of the things we're going to work at, because we have problems within that process as well for ourselves, especially on the engineering side. It works pretty well for the planning side, but I think the other part of that is that trying to find out how to get uses out of that process through developing standards for them that we would allow them under, and having them follow those standards, so we don't have so many people in the process to begin with.
And
The state process and the notice requirements are pretty cumbersome.
Right.
Once you get into that process.
So my last question, just to throw out, is, and I don't know, sir, if your firm works with this end of the process or not, but the commission side of us prepping and being ready to hear these cases, as you referenced the agenda that we have for just tonight of 400 and some odd plus pages, and I haven't found a way yet that's satisfactory to me, I should say, to get to everything I feel like I want to know to be ready for an agenda like tonight, which really isn't a difficult agenda, but it's a lot of information. And Mr. Richardson knows that on some of these previous agendas, I've struggled with missing pieces because we've worked hard internally to try to collapse, if you will, so much information and make some of it available via audio, and then I find myself having to ask staff to go back and find me the link so that I can listen to the hour of testimony that I need to hear. It's either that or attend the planning and zoning board meetings, which I don't have time to do, and they stretch on for hours and hours. So I just wonder about that whole part of it, and whether you all work with municipalities on any of that piece of it.
Yes, the best way to deal with that is to put less things on your plate. And I know that's easy, and again, that's the hard lift here, because it's easier said than done. If we can get the community to support a standard that you would routinely apply as a condition of approval after going through the public hearing process, I think it makes sense to say, if we're going to do this anyway, why do we have to go through this public hearing to do this? You know what people are going to say. We know what the community wants. And that's where we're going to end up. And that's part of our task here, is going through a lot of these uses. And I mentioned, up there what things tend to aggravate the public, and your constituents and so forth. And when we presented to the Planning Commission a few weeks ago, I mean, there were, I don't know how many short-term rentals, that had to go to the Planning Commission, and 3 of them, no comments. One of them was controversial. But what standards can we apply so that those things, even the Planning Commission, I mean, ideally, the Planning Commission is sort of at 30,000 feet making policy. That's what you all should be doing in a perfect world. So things that we can resolve administratively through standards are the best way to deal with that, because that way you can focus. Your agenda should drop down to, a lot smaller than it is tonight, if we can. So that's part of our task here, I think.
We have to use what we've learned on those. Like on the short-term rentals, we've learned that if somebody lives there, we don't have any neighbor objections. If they don't live there, then on third to half of them, we have some neighbors that are real interested in that in one way or another. So we have to think of those things and how we dealt with a lot of these special use permits especially, and what has gone well and what hasn't, and let the stuff that's gone well we know how to deal with that administratively, and keep the other stuff in the special use permit or some other public process, that because we know it will garner more attention in the future.
Commissioner McGee?
Thanks, Mayor. So I haven't had as many problems or concerns. There's been problems and concerns with the planning and zoning process, and it sounds like you're going to address those. I've had more of issues with equal enforcement of those codes in the time that I've been here. The only example that I can really give you right now is after the Walmart Neighborhood Market was built on a Superfund site that sat dormant for 30 years, somebody decided that their outside vending machines needed to be removed. So they called them and removed them, which caused a lot of phone calls to me, which prompted me to go out and take pictures of all the vending machines in front of almost every other grocery store in the county. And not to mention a whole other variety of places that had outdoor vending. So I think it's important that when we make rules that we enforce them for everyone equally, regardless of where they're at. And that we do it in a very open and public way, so that everybody's on the same page. I also think that, I hope, I don't know exactly these committees, I know that I was asked to appoint a couple of people to this committee. I know that they asked for them to be local. A lot of the developers that work in Wyandotte County that do larger developments, many of them unfortunately don't reside in Wyandotte County, and I just hope that there is a forum to hear from the developers about and get their input about what has been an impediment for them. One of the things that I just saw, again, sticking with the Walmart market, it was definitely an unusual deal to have a market be built in an urban neighborhood and on a Superfund site. But there were also some business and industry standards within Walmart as to the kind of facility that they were building. They weren't just picking out a specific design for that site. It was sort of what they were doing across the board, across the country. So when we see those kinds of things, we may have our own standard and have some influence, but when there's a very large gap between what the business is willing to invest and what our code is, we have to decide, and I can't speak for all the commissioners, whether or not we want those 90 jobs and that retail access, affordable retail access, versus a specific kind of siding or roofing material on the building. So hopefully there's a way to address that comprehensively instead of just based on individual deals that happen. I know that with the Menards that just came through, one of the things holding up that large development was cart corrals. Their standard industry internal, or their standard internally is that they put in metal cart corrals. But our code says they have to have some, I think it's masonry work around them. So I'm glad we did that deal. We moved it through anyway. I think it's a good deal. The metal cart corrals at a hardware store, I think, are okay. However, there were businesses prior to that that came in that were held to that standard of building masonry cart corrals. And you think that's not really a big deal, but there's like 10 of those issues. When Menards came in front of us, that was one of probably 20 things that they hadn't complied with, and that was holding up this huge development deal. So hopefully, I don't know what the answer is. That's why we have you apparently. So hopefully there's going to be an easier way to deal with those things.
We will have a meeting with the development community. We'll invite everybody that's submitted an application for probably 5 years back. So we'll catch all those folks that have been in from out of town and do that. One of the other, related to the question that you asked about what are the standards and what do they do, one of the other games that is played by the national retailers is they will come in and they'll have grades of stores, and they'll say, oh, that's KCK, we'll give them the grade D or E, when a community to our south might get a grade A building, and are we satisfied with that? And I think that's another question we need to ask, because even with Menards, we got close to what they would do for someone else, but not all the way to the top of what their best building would be. And do we want their best buildings? Do we need their best buildings? I mean, those are questions that we need to ask, because they will usually play a little bit of a game within the standards in that.
So we have run out of time. Thank you for your presentation. Concludes this meeting. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Coming up on UGTV. A special session of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.